Has anyone used Google Classroom before? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm going to put the code for the room in the chat. And everybody needs to make sure that they join the Google Classroom so then you can see everything that we did in case you miss one of the sessions. And I will also be putting any homework that you have to do on there. So there you go.
Wait, how do you get into Google? Do you like just go in?
Here, I'll show you. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. So here's what the Google Classroom looks like. I'm also going to put this link right now into the chat. And you visit this website. Hold on, let me put it in the chat. And then all you have to do is enter in the code, which I also put into the chat. It'll prompt you for one. So here. Okay. And that's where I'm going to be posting everything. All right. As we wait for a few more people to come in, I think we could probably introduce ourselves pretty quickly. My name is Ella, and I'm going to be telling you for the next few weeks about Matilda, which is a book that we're going to be going through. And so if everybody could go around, and I would like you to say your name, and if you could choose any superpower, what would it be? And we can start with Landon.
I want to be psychic.
You want to be psychic? Actually, Matilda is psychic in the book. So you'll get to see how she uses her powers. Okay, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced anyone's name. Severe, what superpower would you have if you could have any superpower?
I would like to fly.
Yeah, me too. All right, and Ravant, if you could have any superpower, what would it be?
I want to be psychic, just like Matilda too. Yeah, I want to be able to control things.
Yeah, she can move things with her head, and we're going to be actually mostly talking about that. So you can you see the slideshow? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let me hide this really quickly. Okay. So this is Matilda right here, and she lives in a village in England, and she can read very well at a very young age, but her parents basically do not care at all, and they don't understand how special she is. But when she goes to school, she also discovers that she has magical powers and that she is psychic. So we're gonna go over really quickly, review some things. And if you haven't seen any of this before, stop and let me know so I can explain it better. And we're going to be talking first about literary devices. So that's things like similes and metaphors and all of the tools that people who write books use in order to help you better understand the story. So first, again, I'm sure you've seen this before, but if you haven't, let me know and I'll go over it more. So a simile is when you compare two things using like or as. So Miss Trunchbull never walked, she always marched like a stormtrooper. So the simile in that sentence is like a stormtrooper. And here, when Miss Wormwood arrived back from the garage that evening, his face was as dark as a thundercloud. So that is dark as a thundercloud. Those are the similes. And, okay, metaphor. So a metaphor is when you compare two things without using like or as. So they kind of look like the author is just saying facts, but they're not supposed to be taken literally, which just means that you're not really supposed to take them seriously or at face value. So when the author says she was a fierce tyrannical monster, he doesn't actually mean that the lady is a monster. He's just describing her as if she were one. And for a moment or two, I was flying past the stars on silver wings. These are all from Matilda, so they will make more sense when we start reading, and you'll be able to see the sentences actually in the book. So, and okay, alliteration. These are really easy. It's just when multiple words start with the same sound. So like high hedge of hazel. They can be separated by one short word like of, but you can see high hedge and hazel all start with H. So those are really easy to identify. Yeah. And imagery is what you could technically say is most of a book. So imagery is when the author tries to paint a picture in your mind using all of the senses. Oh, 1 second. Yeah, okay. So, here we go. That's the Google Classroom website address, by the way. Okay. And, yeah. Imagery usually appeals to all of the senses. So like taste, touch, sight, sound, and smell. So you have here with sight, you've got golden autumn, and then touch, cold winter, scarlet for the birds. So this is pretty much like if we're going through Matilda and you see an example of imagery, you could technically say that most of the book is imagery. So you really only want to choose examples. We'll talk about that later, but that are the most vivid and like paint the most vivid picture. So there we go. All right, we're gonna talk about that in a second. Before we move on though, I want to know if any of you guys can come up with some examples on your own. So can anybody think of a simile that they might see, or just make one up? And if you can't, that's okay. But can anyone make up a simile? No? That's okay. All right, we will talk more about these because we're going to go through the first chapter of the book together, and I will show you some more examples of these. So here we can move on to something that I'm not sure anyone in this group has ever heard of before, so it might be a little bit complicated at first, but basically this is just saying that stories are organized in two parts. So plot structure is essentially how all the parts are arranged in order to tell the story. So the introduction, or sometimes it's called the exposition, but we'll just call it the introduction. That's basically just the beginning of the story, where all of the people that are in it, all of the characters are introduced, and when you learn about the world that they exist in. And so when the character encounters an issue or a conflict, then that's when the rising action starts. And the climax is usually toward the end of the story, and you can tell that something is the climax when it essentially determines how the story will end. So we will talk more about that in a second. But then basically after that is the falling action, which is everything that happens between the climax, which determines the ending, and the resolution, which is just the end of the book. Matilda's plot structure is a little funny, where the resolution is literally just the last page. So that will be pretty easy to figure out, but the climax might be a little difficult, and we'll talk about that later. But you might have seen this pyramid before. I remember I hated this a lot when I was in school, or in elementary school, but you could organize like a story into a pyramid like this, and we will also talk about that more later. So it's usually not actually the climax, though it's in the middle at the top of the pyramid here. It's usually not in the middle of the story. It's usually more at the end. But okay, I promise we will talk about things that are less boring in a second. Does anyone have a copy of the book, like with them? Because I have a PDF if you don't. You do? Okay.
I have a book. I have a book of Matilda.
Oh, that's the one I have here. Yeah, excellent. Okay, that'll make things easier later. But yeah. So is everyone here familiar with Cinderella?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's pretty basic.
Movie.
Yeah. So this is like just an example of plot structure. So the exposition is basically just where we find out who Cinderella is, and so she gets adopted, I guess, by her stepsisters and her stepmother, and she becomes a maid at their house. And then all the stuff happens where she has to go to a ball, and she isn't allowed to go. So then the fairy godmother comes and transforms all of her things into nicer things. And then Prince Charming tries to find her after her glass slipper falls off. This is
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So this is basically just like the conflict here that would start the rising action would be that she isn't allowed to go to the ball. And then the climax, which will determine the ending, is when the prince brings her the shoe and it is the perfect fit for her. And because the shoe fits, the story can end, because then she gets to go to the castle and live with the prince, and all of her sisters have to become her servants. So and that is what allows the story to end, which makes it the climax, and the resolution is very neat and tidy. She just lives happily ever after. Okay, so that is basically the stuff that we're going to be looking at in Matilda, and I'm going to show you one more thing. I don't know if you guys have done these in school before, but this is basically what you're going to be finding when you read Matilda outside of class. So notice and note, this is like the name, that isn't really that important. But so, okay, something that I really did not really care about that much when I was in elementary school was that every sentence in the book exists in the book for a reason. So basically, the author put everything in there for a reason, and what these like little strategies that I'm about to show you are supposed to do is help you find the most important parts of the story. So when you read on your own, I'm going to want you to find one of these every chapter, or at least try to. Now you can also find one literary device per chapter, which is those things that we just talked about. And I will put this presentation and the other presentation that we just went through on Google Classroom, so you don't have to write these down or remember all of these, because that would be a pain. But okay, the first thing is contrasts and contradictions. So a contradiction is when something is very different than what we expect. And contrasts and contradictions happen in the book, like when characters behave differently than we expect them to. So you'll see what an example of that is in the first chapter of Matilda, when her parents just kind of don't like her. They really don't like her at all, which is something that you wouldn't expect because most parents like their children. So an aha moment is another one, and that's when a character realizes something very important, and there aren't actually usually a lot of these in the book, but because they usually change the character's actions like a lot, and sometimes they will cause the end of the story or conflict, but there usually aren't a lot of these. It's just when the character discovers something or figures something out and it changes their actions. And tough questions are pretty much characters that questions ask themselves, and they will reveal usually a character's internal conflict, because if they weren't having an internal conflict, then they wouldn't be questioning themselves. So internal conflicts are different than external conflicts. And internal conflict is basically when the character is having a hard time figuring something out about themselves, or if they're being challenged by their own feelings, like they're upset about something. But an external conflict would be like when Cinderella wasn't allowed to go to the ball. It's when another character stops them from doing something. But anyway, these are way easier to find. Words of the wiser happen whenever an older character or a more experienced character tells the main character or the person who is telling the story about life, just teaches them a lesson. And there's a character in Matilda called Miss Honey, who's Matilda's teacher, and she is probably going to be telling Matilda most of these. Okay, so again and again they're also very easy to find. They're just things that happen over and over again in the story. So that can be an event, it can be a thing that recurs in the story or you see a lot of times. It can be specific words that are repeated over and over again, or it can be ideas. So it can be literally anything. And memory moments are also easy to spot. You might have heard it as a flashback before. It's basically just when the character interrupts the story that's moving forward to talk about something that happened before or in the past. So they usually have taken place before the story started, or it's a character remembering something that happened earlier in the story. Okay, that's later. All right, and now we can go through something that's actually fun. And we're gonna start reading the first chapter of Matilda. So, and I will be going through and spotting all of the things that we just talked about. So if anyone has any questions, just unmute yourself and stop me and let me know, and I will explain whatever it is that needs answering. Okay. So we are going to start with the very first chapter. And all right. This is not actually Matilda talking. This is the author, Roald Dahl, who lives in Britain. So sometimes he uses different words for things than we do. But he says, "It's a funny thing about mothers and fathers. Even when their own child is the most disgusting little blister you could ever imagine, they still think that he or she is wonderful." There we go. Some parents go further. They become so blinded by adoration that they manage to convince themselves that their child has qualities of a genius. So, adoration. Yeah, that's a big word. Hold on. Well, there's color. There we go. Okay. So, adoration basically just means like a lot of love for something, or when somebody respects something a lot, they will adore it. So adoration is just, in this case, whenever their parents are like doting on their children or complimenting them a lot. All right. Well, there is nothing very wrong with this. It's the way of the world. It's only when the parents begin telling us about the brilliance of their own revolting offspring that we that we start shouting, "Bring us a basin, we're going to be sick." So a basin, that's sometimes Roald Dahl uses different words for things than we do because he's British and we live in America. But a basin is like a sink or a bucket or something that you can throw up in. And okay. So, school teachers suffer a good deal from having to listen to this sort of twaddle from proud parents, but they usually get their own back when it comes time to write end-of-term reports. If I were a teacher, I would cook up some real scorchers for the children of doting parents. Your son, Maximilian, I would write, is a total washout. I hope you have family business you can push him into. You leave school because he sure as heck won't get a job anywhere else. Or if I were feeling lyrical that day, I might write, it is a curious truth that grasshoppers have their hearing organs in the sides of the abdomen, which basically just means that they have their ears here and not on their heads. Your daughter, Vanessa, judging by what she has learned this term, has no hearing organs at all. That would be another literary device that you might have heard of before. It's called a hyperbole. And a hyperbole is basically when the author makes an exaggeration that wouldn't otherwise make any sense. So obviously Vanessa does have ears, she just isn't using them. So he would say that she has no hearing organs at all. And this book has pictures. So there's some of them too. Okay. I might delve even deeper into natural history and say the periodical cicada spends 6 years as a grub underground and no more than 6 days as a free creature of sunlight and air. Your son Wilfred has spent 6 years as a grub in this school, and we are still waiting for him to emerge from his chrysalis. So a chrysalis is like a cocoon that a butterfly goes into, and they come out a butterfly, but or that a caterpillar goes into and it comes out a butterfly. But this is a metaphor. So obviously Wilfred, or hopefully Wilfred, isn't actually a grub. He's just being compared to a grub. But anyway, yeah. A particularly poisonous little girl might sting me into saying, Fiona has the same glacial beauty as an iceberg, but unlike the iceberg, she has absolutely nothing below the surface. So as an iceberg, that's a simile. One of the things that I thought was tricky when I was learning was the like or as part. So you can compare two things using like or as, and this is a simile using as. And you can count unlike the iceberg also as a simile because it's still comparison. I think I might enjoy writing end of term reports for the stinkers in my class, but enough of that, we have to get on. Occasionally, one comes across parents who take the opposite line, who show no interest at all in their children. And these, of course, are far worse than the doting ones. So you know right now that the author is about to introduce a contrast or contradiction, which is one of the things that we talked about before, where something happens that we don't expect. And so we usually expect parents to have some sort of interest or love for their children, but Matilda's parents evidently do not. Let me move that. Okay. Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood were two such parents. They had a son called Michael and a daughter called Matilda, and the parents looked upon Matilda in particular as nothing more than a scab. A scab is something you have to put up with until the time comes when you can pick it off and flick it away. Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood looked forward enormously to the time where they could pick their little daughter off and flick her away, preferably into the next country, or even farther than that. So, let me keep going. Oop. It is bad enough when parents treat ordinary children as though they were scabs and bunions, and that's another simile, as though they were scabs and bunions. But it somehow becomes a lot worse when the child in question is extraordinary, and by that I mean sensitive and brilliant. Matilda was both of these things, but above all, she was brilliant. Her mind was so nimble, and that just means quick, or fast. And she was so quick to learn that her ability should have been obvious even to the most half-witted of parents. But Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood were both so gormless and wrapped up in their own silly little lives that they failed to notice anything unusual about their daughter. Gormless pretty much just means stupid, but that's a British word. And to tell the truth, I doubt they would have noticed had she crawled into the house with a broken leg. And that's another exaggeration or a hyperbole. Okay. All right. Matilda's brother Michael was a perfectly normal boy, but the sister, as I said, was something to make your eyes pop. By the age of 1.5, her speech was perfect, and she knew as many words as most grown-ups. The parents, instead of applauding her, called her a noisy chatterbox and told her sharply that small girls should be seen and not heard. By the time she was 3, Matilda had taught herself to read, studying newspapers and magazines that lay around the house. At the age of 4, she could read fast and well, and she naturally began hankering after books, which basically just means asking for them. And the only book in the whole of this enlightened household was something called Easy Cooking, belonging to her mother. And when she had read this from cover to cover and had learnt all the recipes by heart, she decided that she wanted something more interesting. And enlightened just means educated or learned. "Daddy," she said, "do you think you could buy me a book?" "A book?" he said. "What do you want a flaming book for?" "To read, Daddy." "What's wrong with the telly, for heaven's sake?" And that's a British word for television. "We've got a lovely 12-inch screen, and now you come asking for a book. You're getting spoiled, my girl." Nearly every weekday afternoon, Matilda was left alone in the house. Her brother, 5 years older than her, went to school. Her father went to work, and her mother went out playing bingo in a town 8 miles away. Mrs. Wormwood was hooked on bingo and played it 5 afternoons a week. On the afternoon of the day when her father had refused to buy her a book, Matilda set out all by herself to walk to the public library in the village. When she arrived, she introduced herself to the librarian, Mrs. Phelps. She asked if she might sit a while and read a book. Mrs. Phelps, slightly taken aback by the arrival of such a tiny girl unaccompanied by a parent, nevertheless told her that she was very welcome. "Where are the children's books, please?" Matilda asked. "They're over there on those lower shelves," Mrs. Phelps told her. "Would you like me to help you find a nice one with lots of pictures in it?" "No, thank you," Matilda said. "I'm sure I can manage." From then on, every afternoon, as soon as her mother had left for bingo, Matilda would toddle down to the library. The walk only took 10 minutes, and this allowed her 2 glorious hours sitting quietly by herself in a cozy corner, devouring one book after another. So devouring just means eating, and she's obviously not actually eating the books. That would be kind of tragic, but that just means that she's going through them at a really high speed, so she's reading really fast. And when she had read every single children's book in the place, she started wandering around in search of something else. Mrs. Phelps, who had been watching her with fascination for the past few weeks, now got up from her desk and went over to her. "Can I help you, Matilda?" she asked. Oh, sorry. I'm wondering what to read next, Matilda said. I finished all the children's books. You mean you've looked at the pictures? Oh, by the way, I never even asked, can everybody see the screen that I'm on right now? Can they all see the text of the book? Really? Oh my goodness, that's horrible. Okay, hold on. Okay, there we go. Next time.
Yeah, now we can see it.
Oh yeah, you can see it? Now you can see it? Okay. Can you let me know next time?
Okay.
Look like I'm a crazy person. Okay, that's gonna be way more interesting for you guys because now you can read ahead if I'm going too slow. All right. So, all right, you mean you've looked at the pictures? Yes, but I've read the books as well. Mrs. Phelps looked down at Matilda from her great height, and Matilda looked right back up at her. I thought some were very poor, but the others were lovely. I liked the secret garden best of all. It was full of mystery. The mystery of the room behind the closed door, and the mystery of the wall behind the big wall. Or the mystery of the garden behind the big wall. And there's a picture. Okay. And Mrs. Phelps was stunned. Exactly how old are you, Matilda? She asked. 4 years and 3 months, Matilda said. Mrs. Phelps was more stunned than ever, but she had the sense not to show it. What sort of book would you like to read next? She asked. Matilda said, I would like a really good one that grown-ups read, a famous one. I don't know any names. Mrs. Phelps looked along the shelves, taking her time. She didn't quite know what to bring out. How, she asked herself, does one choose a famous grown-up book for a 4-year-old girl? Her first thought was to pick a young teenager's romance of the kind that is written for 15-year-old schoolgirls, but for some reason she found herself instinctively walking past that particular shelf. Instinctively basically just means following the feeling in your gut or a feeling that you have that you can't explain. And all right, try this, she said at last. It's very famous and very good. If it's too long for you, just let me know and I'll find something a bit shorter and easier. Great Expectations, Matilda read, by Charles Dickens. I'd love to try it. I must be bad, Mrs. Phelps told herself, but to Matilda she said, of course you may try it. Over the next few afternoons, Mrs. Phelps could hardly take her eyes from the small girl sitting for hour after hour in the big armchair at the far end of the room, the book on her lap. It was necessary to rest it on the lap because it was too heavy for her to hold up, which meant she had to sit leaning forward in order to read. And a strange sight it was, this tiny dark-haired person sitting there with her feet nowhere near touching the floor, totally absorbed in the wonderful adventures of Pip and old Miss Havisham and her cobwebbed house, and by the spell of the magic that Dickens, the great storyteller, had woven with his words. So that is kind of a confusing one, but it's also a metaphor. Obviously, Charles Dickens, who's the author of Great Expectations, did not cast a spell or weave anything, but he, like, the author is comparing it to a spell because it's such a good book. And the only movement from the reader was the lifting of the hand every now and then to turn over a page. Mrs. Phelps always felt sad when the time came for her to cross the floor and say, it's 10-5, Matilda. Oh, hello. Sorry, someone new just joined.
Mom.
Hi. We're reading Matilda right now. We're in the middle of the first chapter. If you don't have the book, you can pull up the PDF that's on Google Classroom. Okay, and during the first week of Matilda's visits, Mrs. Phelps, there we go, had said to her, does your mother walk you down here every day and then take you home? My mother goes to Aylesbury every afternoon to play bingo, Matilda had said. She doesn't know I come here. But surely that's not right, Mrs. Phelps said. I think you'd better ask her. I'd rather not, Matilda said. She doesn't encourage reading books. Neither does my father. But what do they expect you to do every afternoon in an empty house? Just mooch around and watch the telly. I see. She doesn't really care what I do, Matilda said, a little sadly. Perhaps Mrs. Phelps was concerned about the child's safety on the walk through the fairly busy village high street and crossing of the road, but she decided not to interfere. And interfere basically just means step in and do something about it. So if she were to interfere, she would probably stop Matilda from crossing the street every day, but she didn't. So within a week, Matilda had finished Great Expectations, in which that edition contained 411 pages. I loved it, she said to Mrs. Phelps. Has Mr. Dickens written any others? A great number, said the astounded Mrs. Phelps. Shall I choose you another? Over the next 6 months, under Mrs. Phelps' watchful and compassionate eye, Matilda read the following books: Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice. I have no idea how to say that. I'm not gonna lie. I don't. Gone to Earth, Kim, The Invisible Man, The Old Man and the Sea, The Sound and the Fury, Grapes of Wrath, The Good Companions, Brighton Rock, and Animal Farm. It was a formidable list, and formidable just means like scary or imposing or threatening. And by now, Mrs. Phelps was filled with wonder and excitement, but it was probably a good thing that she did not allow herself to be completely carried away by it all. Anyone else, witnessing the achievements of this small child, would have been tempted to make a great fuss and shout the news all over the village and beyond, but not so Mrs. Phelps. She was someone who minded her own business and had long since discovered it was seldom worthwhile to interfere with other people's children, and seldom means rarely or almost never. Mr. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand, Matilda said to her, especially about men and women, but I loved it all the same. The way he tells it, I feel I am right there on the spot watching it all happen. A fine writer will always make you feel that, Mrs. Phelps said. And don't worry about the bits you can't understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you like music. I will. Did you know, Mrs. Phelps said, that public libraries like this allow you to borrow books and take them home? I didn't know that, Matilda said. Could I do it? Of course, Mrs. Phelps said. When you have chosen the book you want, bring it to me, and I can make note of it. And it's yours for 2 weeks. You can take more than one if you wish. From then on, Matilda would visit the library only once a week in order to take out new books and return. There we go. The old ones. Her own small bedroom now became her reading room, and there she would sit and read most afternoons with a mug of hot chocolate beside her. She was not quite tall enough to reach things around the kitchen, but she kept a small box in the outhouse which she brought in and stood on in order to get whatever she wanted. Mostly it was hot chocolate she made, warming the milk in a saucepan or on the stove before mixing it. Occasionally she made Bovril or Ovaltine. It's like powder that you mix into drinks, but I don't think anybody has actually made Bovril or Ovaltine since the 80s, so you don't have to worry about that. It was pleasant to take a hot drink up to her room and have it beside her as she sat in her silent room, reading in the empty house in the afternoons. The books transported her to new worlds and introduced her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She went on olden-day sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India with Rudyard Kipling. She traveled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. So this is another metaphor where obviously she isn't actually traveling all over the world, but when she's reading, she feels like she's traveling all over the world. And here is, there we go. There's another picture of her. All right, and since that was a lot, we can stop and take a break if you want, and everyone can, excuse me, I want, how about this? 1 second. Okay, there we go. and everyone to go around and to say something that they're really good at. And is everyone still here? No? Okay. Hold on. There we go. And we can start with Severe. Let's say something that you are really good at.
I'm good at drawing.
Yeah, I love to draw too. And Ravant, can you say something you're really good at?
Yeah, I'm good at biking and playing my guitar.
I wish I could play a guitar. My friend
Yeah.
can play the guitar really well, and I want him to start a band. I'm awful. I could never play a guitar. I am tone deaf. So I respect you. And
Yeah.
oh, someone new just joined too.
Hello.
Hi. Right now we just finished the first chapter of Matilda, and but we're taking a break at the moment. We're almost done, but asking everybody to go around and to say something they're really good at. So, can you say something that you're really good at?
In reading or
Anything at all.
I'm good at science.
Yeah, I wish I could be good at science. I want to go to college for science. But, and Apu, could you say something that you're really good at? It's okay if you don't want to unmute yourself, but you can go for it. No? That's fine. You can put it in the chat too. And if you're shy, it's easier that way. All right. Anyway, so we're pretty much almost done. I'm going to really quickly, if I can actually share my screen this time, do some very quick practice with similes and metaphors just to review. Here. And all right. Here we go. All right. I think you can draw on my screen, which is interesting, but anyway, okay. So which sentence uses a metaphor? The bear, okay, can you see this time?
What does a metaphor mean?
Yeah, okay. So let me show you. Hold on. All right. So a metaphor is basically when you compare two things without using like or as. So they kind of look like they're just facts, but the author does not really want you to take them at face value. So like she was a fierce tyrannical monster, which is different than basically you're talking about these in comparison to similes, which is another new term, where she says she always marched like a stormtrooper or dark as a thundercloud. If you have a metaphor, you would say Miss Trunchbull never walked. She always like sure she was a stormtrooper. Or if you were to make
I know what a simile is.
yeah, okay. So a simile or metaphor is basically just a simile without the word as or like in it. So out of these options that I'm about to give you, the one without like in it would be the metaphor. So here, let me make sure. Here we go. Okay, can everybody see this little green, this website with the green bar at the top? You can? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, which is
Yeah, which sentence is a metaphor? Okay, so
the first one.
hold on, let me finish reading them. The bare tree's branches were sharp as needles, or the bare tree's branches were sharp needles. So which one? We have a poll.
It's the first one. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not as in it.
Excellent. Okay.
The tired woman fell into
the bed.
Oh, this is a simile. Yeah. Like
Excellent.
So it's a simile.
Teamwork. All right.
Both were muddy.
As pigs.
First one. It's the first one.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent work. Okay. And here, before you answer, I'm going to read them first to give everybody time to look at them. So the cat's silver eyes were 2 shiny coins, and the cat's silver eyes were like 2 shiny coins. So that one's easy. Which one is a simile?
Or like.
Yeah. Excellent. Great. And okay, one more simile. And the boy was
The third one.
or the tired boy was
It's the second
The
one.
second one.
Excellent. Good work. Okay, now here. Before anyone says anything, severe. Which one do you think uses a simile? His voice
I
or voices is decent?
second one.
The second one.
Second one? Yep. All right. Cool.
The colorful blooming flowers.
Of spring are nature's grandest artwork. Oh, that's a long sentence. Okay.
Metaphor. It's a metaphor.
All right. Let's see. Here you go. Okay. And across the room, Uncle Kurt's laughter was booming thunder.
Metaphor.
This is a metaphor too.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is getting easy.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Now I'm gonna no one say anything yet. Becky went down the slide face first like a penguin. Or Vaughn.
Simile.
Simile? Yeah. All right. So you guys have got this. Basically, all I want you to do when I'm going to tell you what you're going to read tonight, and I would like you to find either per chapter one of these strategies that I went over before, and who's drawing on the screen?
Sorry.
It's okay. Or each chapter, if you can't find one of these, you can find one of these literary devices too. And I'm gonna post both of these presentations on the Google Classroom. So
Do we have like homework or something?
yeah, okay.
Okay.
You have here, let me show you first. Have you ever used Google Classroom before?
Yes.
You have?
I did.
Yeah. Do you know how to join a class?
There's like this code. So you have to write it on like there's a box that appears.
Yeah.
Like
So I'm gonna give you the code to our class. It's gonna be, I'm just gonna put it in the chat again, so it'll be easier. And oops, okay, here we go.
okay.
And you can just copy and paste that into the box that comes up, and then you will be in the Google Classroom. But I'll put everything on there, including the homework. But the homework for just until next time, it's kind of long, but you guys got this stuff really easily today, so it'll be easy for you. Don't worry. And I want you guys to read from Mr. Wormwood, the Great Car Dealer, which is the chapter after the one we just read, through Miss Honey, which is, these chapters don't have numbers, they only have names, so you'll see which number that is. But
what is the code number? I mean, like the code.
I put it in the chat of the Zoom call.
Okay.
If you can't see it, let me know, and I can email it to you afterward. But there also, if you don't have the Matilda book, there's a full PDF. So there's the whole book is on Google Classroom, so you can read it if you don't have a physical copy, but some of you do. Excellent work. But we're reading Matilda. If you didn't see it in the email. Sorry, what's your name?
Srivatsa.
Okay, yeah. So we're reading Matilda, and there was a PDF, so you're probably gonna have to read the first chapter by yourself. And I'm sure you will not have any trouble with that. But again, I just want you guys to find at least one literary device, like a simile or a metaphor, like what we just went over, or one notice and note strategy, and that is these things. So the contrasts and contradictions, all this stuff. So if you can find either a literary device or one of these per chapter. And there are some words in this book that I had to look up when I read it the first time through. This is optional. You don't have to do this, but I'm going to put something on Google Classroom that will help you with the vocabulary. It's basically just making your own vocabulary list. I'm not going to make you like have a vocabulary list set where you have to go through and find the definitions or memorize them or anything like that. It's just basically working on context clues yourself. But
Okay.
and the last thing is basically just join the Google Classroom, and that is all that you have to do. So I
Okay.
think it's like 5 chapters, but other than that, we are pretty much done. So if you need to take a screenshot of this or anything, go ahead, but I will put it on the Google Classroom. So you don't have to worry about writing it down as long as you have the code. Is everybody, did everybody figure out how to get into Google Classroom? It's also in the email that they sent to your parents if you're not in Google Classroom. So is everyone good?
Yes.
Yeah? Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. So here, everyone else except for the people that just joined when we were in the middle of reading, pretty much everyone else is good. And thank you so much for coming. But I'm going to explain and go through these one more time for anyone who didn't see them. So if you have seen these already, the notice and note annotation strategies, that's pretty much all I have for you. But